Hi everyone. There's a lot going on at the moment, and I'll be uploading a number of videos in due course with the ongoing events. Today, of course, is the second inauguration of Donald Trump, and as you won't be surprised to hear, I've got views on that. So I'll be talking about that later. And there's a few other things that I want to touch on, but this video, I actually came across a meme with Bart Simpson, the famous sort of thing in The Simpsons, if you've ever watched that show, with Bart writing on the board, I will not, do, do, do. And I think the line on this one was, I will not confuse Islamophobia with bigotry or something like that. But the point of it was criticizing this term Islamophobia, and I agreed with it. You know, sometimes memes can be infantile and just trash, honestly. But on this occasion, I think it was apt. So I want to talk about this. I've probably mentioned it before on this channel. In fact, I'm certain I have. But it's one of those things that's always relevant because it's in the discourse of our society. Um, Islamophobia has been bandied about for years now. I don't know the precise origins of the term. I'd imagine it began sometime after 9/11, but might even go back further than that. Possibly in the 90s when Islamist extremism was starting to rear its ugly head. Um, but it's being used as a way to describe anti-Muslim bigotry. The argument being that all Muslims are part of the same brush over extremists. But the problem is it goes further than that. I think it is weaponized to silence legitimate debate. I do not like the term, and I do not use the term unless it's in quoting it. I do not use the term myself because I do think it's weaponized. Um, and frankly, I think too many Muslims are in denial about the reality of Islamic extremism. Now, I honestly believe the average Muslim person out there just minds their own business. They get on with their lives, support the local football team. They maybe go to mosque if they're religious. They may read the Quran if they're religious. They go Tesco. They're ordinary people who just get on with their lives. But a lot of Muslims will say that Islamism or that sort of terrorism has nothing to do with Islam. I think this is fundamentally dishonest. I think it's a reactionary response because, understandably, if your faith means a lot to you, you won't want it to be associated with extremists. But I would say that arguing Islamic extremism has nothing to do with Islam is as absurd as saying that the Crusades, the medieval Crusades, had nothing to do with Christianity. Of course, they were connected to Christianity. They were ordained by popes and Christian kings to wage war in the Holy Land and so on. Today, when we see groups like ISIS, Boko Haram, and others, the idea that they're killing people. Sometimes, in some cases, they've literally picked out who is Muslim and who isn't, um, and they're violently spreading, as they see it, their caliphate. The idea that that has nothing to do with theological interpretations is absolute nonsense. It's evasive nonsense. And it seems to me that people who always go down the line, it's nothing to do with Islam, they're more concerned. They seem to be more concerned about the image of their faith than about some of the evil things that's being done in its name. It's not good enough to simply condemn terrorism. Anyone can do that. I'm thinking about people like Mehdi Hassan, who, he will condemn violence. That's not good enough. If he's simultaneously, as he does, trying to downplay these sort of threats, this sort of ideology, and always point fingers at the other person, try to portray them as a bigot. It's evasive. Um, and I strongly believe that you cannot solve a problem if you can't openly say what it is. That's just nonsense. It's like you could take this with any issue, and well, I don't want to digress from the main point here, but you could take any problem. Let's say, for instance, there's some deadly pandemic, as we saw in 2020. If you don't diagnose what the problem is, if you don't recognize what it is, how do you tackle it? And how are vaccines developed? Um, School shootings in America. How do you recognize that problem without recognizing the prevalence of guns in America. It's just, I think it's just evasive nonsense. So saying that the likes of Islamic State have nothing to do with Islam, it's just evasive and dishonest, and it helps no one. It doesn't help ordinary Muslims either because it just makes it look like they care more about the image of their faith than actually tackling extremists. Um, and it really angers me. But it isn't just some reactionary Muslims who have this attitude. It's a regressive left, the politically correct left, let's say, because they cannot bring themselves to admit that actually there is a problem with violent extremism here that isn't part of the majority. Um, and so it involves often minority people, so that we better not talk about that. I loathe, I absolutely loathe that sort of cowardly political correctness. Um, we have to be honest about this problem because Europe has seen literally thousands of people killed and wounded in Islamist attacks in France, in Britain, in Germany, in Spain, across the continent. And of course, this is a problem around the world. In fact, this now marks 10 years since one of the worst Islamist atrocities in modern times, which was not that well documented. It was a place called Baga in Nigeria, January 2015, 10 years ago. Reports put the death toll at anything from 200 to 2,000. One of the worst atrocities in modern times, bigger in scale than the Paris attacks. Um, that is a glaring indication of Islamic extremism. And the reactionary attitude to this is always, oh, but you get extremes in every religion. Yes, you do. You get, certain Southern Baptist types who do preach hate. You get, and some Christian cults in Africa. You get Buddhist extremists, you get Jewish extremists, certainly. Some of the settlers, I would argue, in the West Bank are extremists. Um, you get Hindu extremists, far right extremists in India. So, yes, every religion has its extremists. But the pan Islamist nature of this is something that is, I think, unique. Um, you simply don't have these sort of suicide bombings from Hindus or Jews or Buddhists going on in Europe. You just don't see it happening. Well, actually, today the methodology wouldn't be suicide bombing so much as vehicle attacks. But there's another point too. The other whataboutery would be what about far right extremism? Well, I've always spoken out against far right extremism. I have absolutely nothing. I want nothing to do with blood and soil nationalist types. I mean, in Britain, the likes of Patriotic Alternative, National Action, those sort of blood and soil nationalist types who, as far as I'm concerned, a lot of them are racist fucks. Um, and some of their apologists will say they're simply a response to Islamic extremism. Well, it shouldn't be a competition. Extremism is extremism. Okay, so 30, 40 years ago, they wouldn't be conveniently saying, "Oh, we're just speaking out against Islamic extremism." They'd be beating up a Pakistani shopkeeper or a Jewish shopkeeper. So I see them for what they are, and I want nothing to do with them. Um, the fact that they happen to be right about Islamic extremism doesn't make them people who should be looked up to because they're dead wrong in so many other areas. And that they're violent extremists. You know, um, I think the security services are right to take that seriously because, in terms of the actual death toll, it's not on the same scale. But we've seen in Britain as well, far right extremism. But the point I'm making is it shouldn't be a competition. So if someone's talking about Islamic extremism, the response should be, what about far right extremism? Or if someone's talking about far right extremism, it shouldn't be, what about Islamist extremism? I do think people who are moral hypocrites should be challenged. One reason I do not support the group Hope Not Hate, they pretend to be an anti fascist organisation, they pretend to be an anti extremist organisation. They're deadly silent when it comes to Islamist extremism. Now, like I said, it's not a case of whataboutery, but I do think consistency is important, very important. You can't say you're against extremism, but then cherry pick what sort of extremism you're against. Um, but I loathe this term Islamophobia, and I do not trust this Labour government to not put in some sort of legislation that will be a slippery slope to de facto blasphemy laws. Some things Labour has got right, um, and I still maintain just changing government won't necessarily solve the problems in this country because it's not like the Tories are any better. They made a mess. They were in power for 14 years. They made a mess. I still have trust issues over reform. Reform happens to be right about some things. They take a hard line on crime. They're right about the threat of China. There's certain things they're right about, but I don't entirely trust reform, not least for some of their senior leaders' attitude to Russia and Ukraine. But if Labour puts in some sort of legislation to define Islamophobia in a legal framework, and this is not nothing cemented yet, this is all going through, process. But if something actually does come into law, say for instance, criticizing Islam would be a criminal offence, that would be extremely sinister. Now, I don't want to scaremonger. That isn't the case right now. It's not a criminal offence to criticize Islam, but it never should be. And any inkling that this term Islamophobia is molded in such a way that it will be a cover for all of this, to conflate criticism of Islamic dogma with with hatred of Muslims. That is a very dangerous conflation. On that point, I don't say that there is no issue regarding anti-Muslim discrimination. I'm not talking about getting jobs. I'm talking about, for instance, visible Muslims. A woman wearing a headscarf, an imam being abused on the street. That's wrong. Mosques have been vandalized. There's no excuse for that. It's wrong. During the riots, Muslims were unfairly targeted. As we know, in fact, he was on trial today. The suspect was of Rwandan descent, had nothing to do with he wasn't a Muslim. So during those riots, mosques were targeted. That was a disgrace. Lives were threatened. There was one case, I believe it was either in Stockport or Liverpool. Don't quote me on that, where the imam was basically trapped in the building and smoke was coming in. He could have died. So lives were threatened. So I will always condemn anti-Muslim bigotry simply for abusing Muslims for being Muslims. That's wrong. That is absolutely wrong. But I have a big problem with Islamophobia being used as a catch-all. People must have the freedom, definitely to criticize Islamic extremism, but frankly, even to dislike Islam. Ex-Muslims have been threatened for saying they no longer want to follow the faith. They've been threatened for that. That's a disgrace. Anyone who says there is no problem in this country with Islamic extremism is delusional. We have that problem. And we've seen this in Europe. When a teacher, talking about Samuel Paty, is beheaded in the 21st century, that is a barbaric, violent ideology that has done that. That should not be welcomed in any Western democracy. I think that to give Macron his credit, he's been more outspoken than some Western leaders on this. Um, and dare I say, even Trump. I'll give Trump credit where it's due. He has spoken out against Islamic extremism more than the Democrats have. Um, the same can't be said for British leaders. Even conservative leaders were reluctant to say Islamist extremism. You'd be hard pushed to find Keir Starmer saying it. Now, he would reply, but I've prosecuted terrorists as head of the CPS, and maybe he has. But I want to see leaders having the backbone to honestly talk about a problem. When Starmer became leader, I said, okay, it's not going to be as bad as Corbyn. And I don't think he is. But there is a kind of regressive, politically correct side to Starmer I really don't like. A hesitancy. He's too cautious too often. Um, And if we have a situation, in fact, we had, of a teacher being forced into hiding, the Prime Minister should be speaking out in that, saying this is unacceptable in Britain. Those who are threatening him should be prosecuted. He should be free to do his job without fear of violence. I mean, it's an absolute disgrace. So I'm going to wrap this up, but what I would say is I've not a problem with anti-Muslim discrimination being put into some sort of legislation, but we need to be very, very careful that Islamophobia isn't used as an umbrella term to just silence all debate. That would be extremely chilling. Extremely chilling. This was tried on Hamza Yusuf's watch in Scotland, and it was just as controversial there. Obviously, there's devolved systems in the home nations, but I do not trust Labour on this. I do not trust Keir Starmer. I don't think he's going to be so blunt and reckless as to, come out and say, "Oh, it's illegal to criticize Islam." Starmer's never going to say that. But what we could see this is happening by stealth, slow process. So it has to be deeply scrutinised. If any legislation is brought in, you get Lord Ahmed, for example, the Muslim peer, who's constantly aggravating for this sort of legislation to be brought in. I say it is de facto blasphemy laws if we are in a situation where you cannot freely criticise Islam or any religion for that matter. Um, it's got a dangerous effect on free speech. I would say it for any religion. I think Christian dogma can be criticized. I think Judaism can be criticized. I mean, if there are individuals who will use anti-Semitism as a way to silence debate on certain Jewish attitudes, that's wrong. I think all religions should be open to critique. Um, but people also have to remember that, okay, you're criticizing a belief system, you're criticizing an ideology, but you need to differentiate between that and just hating adherents of that. So someone spouting out online about their hatred of Muslims, I'm not going to have much sympathy for them because they're attacking an entire group. Each shit and every man, woman, and child who's a Muslim. That is inflammatory and it's unhelpful and it's I don't think that could be considered to be legitimate criticism of Islam. But when you look at some of the things that happen in conservative Islamic countries like Pakistan, where people are brutally beaten to death for alleged blasphemy. The idea that we cave into that mentality in a relatively free country, it just we freedom is not something we should take for granted. It's not something we should be complacent about. If this government brings in legislation that is effectively back to blasphemy laws, I want to see Kimmy Badenoch and the Tories shouting at the top of their lungs, and the Liberal Democrats, and Reform, and other parties. Although I wouldn't entirely trust the Liberal Democrats to do it either, because they're just as politically correct as Labour. Um, but Reform and the Tories would need to scream at the top of their lungs. This is an attack on free speech. Um, I'm not sure that we actually need new legislation, in fact, because current legislation does cover hate crime. Um, so if a Muslim is a victim of abuse, it's awful. No one should go through that. I have enormous sympathy for them. One last personal anecdote. After the riots, I took part in a kind of peace walk in my city. It was organised by the church in conjunction with our local mosque. The reason I took part in it was A, I was disgusted by the riots. I was disgusted at the blatant racism on display. Um, B, it wasn't an overtly political thing. It wasn't sort of organized by Hope Not Hate or Unite Against Fascism or something. It was simply faith groups coming together. We went to the local mosque and the imam there was welcoming, friendly. Um, but if these sort of subjects came up, if he was to say, I got the impression he was a down to earth guy. I liked him. I got a good impression from him. I don't know the man well enough. If he were to say, we support Islamophobia being weaponized, or not being weaponized, but being, because he wouldn't say that. But if he said, we support a situation where it's basically illegal to criticize Islam, I would be disappointed by that. I expect moderate Muslims to be honest that there's a problem out there. Um, Instead of always getting defensive and saying it's nothing to do with Islam, just acknowledge that there is a problem out there. Acknowledge that there are Islamists in our society who are a threat to our society, um, who absolutely shouldn't be in this country. If they were born in this country, then they need to be de radicalized. And that's another thing. When the government has tried to put out these programs, the Blair government did, then you had self appointed faith groups saying it was Islamophobia. Like the Muslim Council of Britain were putting up barriers to the Prevent program. Why? The Prevent program wasn't targeting Muslims alone, it was targeting all extremism, it was targeting neo Nazi types as well. So why would anyone be against that? I've seen nothing in the Prevent program that suggests that it's unfairly tarnishing all Muslims. So my question to those faith leaders is: do you want to be part of the solution, or do you want to be part of the problem? Do you want to put up barriers when governments actually do try to do something about this? Why don't you work with them and stand against extremism? Be honest about it. So yeah, that's my take on this. I should clarify, nothing has come into legislation just yet, but this is something we can never be complacent about. I don't want to wait till the day where suddenly legislation, and I would actually be breaking the law by even making a video. Now, that is not the situation right now. Despite what Elon Musk says, we do still have free speech in Britain, and people are not jailed for having an opinion. That's not the situation right now. But we can never be complacent about it.